Hi, I'm Shannon Watkins, and I'm here today with Allen Mendenhall, who's an Associate Dean at Faulkner University's Thomas Good Jones School of Law and Executive Director of the Blackstone and Burke Center for Law and Liberty. In addition to being a legal scholar, Allen also holds a PhD in English from Auburn University. Allen, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks, Shannon. I really appreciate being here. Thanks very much.
Well, to get us started, I want to know about your career path. It seems like your academic history shows two different paths. You first majored in English and then went on to get a master's in English and also a PhD. But you also attended law school and now are an associate law dean and executive director of a law center. Why did you ultimately choose a path in law instead of English?
Well, it's an unusual path. So I went to Furman University in Greenville, South Carolina, and got my bachelor's in English there. Moved to Japan for a year and taught English in Japan, and then came back and did a dual degree program at West Virginia University. So I went to law school during the day and got my master's of English at night. And then I went and got an LLM at Temple University in Philadelphia. And while I was in Atlanta, I did my PhD at Auburn University while my wife was working for Coca-Cola. And so it was an unusual path. I finished my doctoral dissertation. At first, I began it, actually. I did my qualifying exams while I was in private practice. So I was trying to bill hours and make clients happy and all these crazy things. And then I would go home at night and work on a dissertation or study for my qualifying exams. It was very stressful. And this was before kids. So after kids, I'm not sure I could have done it. But it was a really good experience. I moved to Alabama and worked as a staff attorney on the Alabama Supreme Court and then as assistant attorney general. But while I was at the Alabama Supreme Court, I finished my PhD in English. And very interesting. I mean, law and literature are sort of mutually illuminating fields in that they're very text-based. You are doing a lot of reading, writing, and interpretation in both disciplines. And there's sort of a hermeneutics to both. You know, literary theory and criticism is all about how do we interpret these literary texts, novels, plays, poems, or how do we communicate? What do these signs mean? And then law is the same way. If you're looking at a statute, you're trying to figure out what the language of that statute means. And just for an example of how the two disciplines might be mutually illuminating, the new critics who wrote in the early 20th century advocated isolating text from externalities. So we're not going to consider the author's intent or the cultural or historical context of this poem. We're just going to treat it as this self-contained text, and we're going to look at it line by line and sort of pretend that we don't know anything about these authors and examine what this text means, because the meaning of a text resides in the text itself, not in the mind of the author, according to the new critics. Well, something similar goes on with textualism in the law. When judges look at statutes and they say, we're not going to look at legislative intent because there really is no such thing. You've got lots and lots and lots of legislators, and they all have different intents. And the resulting statute is often a compromise and not the embodiment of one intent. So it's not necessarily that we look at legislation. We erase all that stuff and we say, okay, what the legislature intended is what appears in the text, and we're going to look at that. So there are ways to see connections between literature and law, and that's just one kind of small example, but there are a lot of other examples. I mean, there's a whole field of law and literature. It's been pretty politicized in recent years, but in its early years, it was actually a pretty conservative enterprise.
Wow. Are there any concerns about how English departments are run?
Well, I think that, English departments are struggling right now. They're in a tough time. The focus in higher education is moving more and more towards practical skills training and things like that, and English departments have a hard time trying to justify how it's useful to study literature, or what skills you learn to study literature, because sometimes the answer is no. I mean, there are no skills. You know, you obviously you gain a facility with language, and writing is good. You learn writing. Writing is a craft. It's not just something that comes naturally to everyone. You train yourself to be a good writer. And one big problem with English departments, I think, has been in the wake of the big literary theory and criticism turn in the 60s and 70s in particular. I mean, post-structuralism and structuralism dominated French intellectual life in the 1960s, and you had deconstructionists like Derrida, and then you had writers like Michel Foucault. And I actually think it's really helpful for students to read these people. I don't think these people should be dismissed out of hand. And there are things that I agree with that some of these figures write. But I think that pulling all literary theory through those paradigms resulted in sort of some residual problems. And one of those is Marxism. I mean, Marxism goes through various iterations throughout the course of the 20th century, after the Frankfurt School. And you see residual Marxism in a lot of literary and cultural studies in just terms like privilege, or terms like superstructure. And all of post-structuralism is looking at these systemic structures, these systemic cultural structures that we can't escape from. We're immersed in them, like we're immersed in discourse, and there's no way to remove yourself from them. You know, and so people talk about, oh, this is race, for example. We're embedded in this deep historical, problematic history of race relations in the United States, and there's no way to get out of it. There's no way to move forward. Just everything is institutionalized racism, and there's no way to work your way out of that without eliminating the structures and the systems that exist altogether, and basically starting from scratch and just wiping the slate clean. At least that's an implication of some of those theories. And I don't think a lot of people, when they talk about these things, they're trying to be helpful. I mean, they're well-meaning people, and they're trying to figure out the right thing to do and trying to discuss difficult issues in a sophisticated way. But a lot of times they're using vocabularies and concepts that come out of Marxist theory, and they're not really understanding the implications of that and what that might mean. And a lot of them haven't really studied the history of communism, in particular students, not the faculty. I mean, faculty are generally very smart, intelligent people, but a lot of impressionable young people, don't know that over 90 million people were annihilated from this planet from socialism and communism. I mean, it's a horrifying thing. We have candidates out there like Bernie Sanders that openly profess to be socialist, and that's not problematic. And, there are all these different labels and categories out there that people can't be. You can't be this, you can't be that, that's bad. And socialism's not one of them. That's sort of amazing to me, given the catastrophic results of it across the planet. I mean, even if you look now at a place like Venezuela, and you look at what's going on down there, it's hard to imagine that this discredited economic system can just get bandied about casually by graduate students over coffee, having fun talking. I mean, this is a very serious thing. Lives are at stake, and people don't tend to treat it seriously.
Do these ideas have any impact on intellectual diversity in these departments?
Well, in what way? I guess, may I ask for a little qualification?
Sure. Did you ever foresee yourself, were you ever interested in perhaps being a professor of English, but were kind of maybe not, because my academic freedom might not be respected in terms of these ideas? Yeah,
and so to give you just sort of a concrete example, sure. When I was working with my initial dissertation advisor, and I say the word initial, which could sort of signals where this story is going, and I was with her for 2 years and had written what I thought was the complete manuscript, and I kept trying to get chapters to her, and she wouldn't let my dissertation committee read the chapters. And while I was a graduate student, I had published a book called Literature and Liberty, which presented free market approaches to literary criticism as an alternative to some of these Marxist paradigms that predominated in English departments. And that didn't make a lot of people happy. I mean, who's this graduate student here who's writing stuff about English professors and English departments? That's not very nice. Who does he think he is? He wants to get a PhD from our program. We're not going to let him do it. So there was a little bit of hazing, I'll put it that way, that went on with that. And I also did an interview with Jeffrey Tucker of the Mises Institute at the time, talking about some of these things. And I remember my dissertation advisor calling me in and really getting upset with me for having done that interview and saying, "What were you thinking? You don't know anything." And I was very taken aback by this. Well, it was shortly after that she started reading my dissertation in a different way. And you could sense that she would comment on parts of my dissertation and impute motives to what I was doing here that revealed that she was sort of presupposing where I was coming from. Oh, he's a libertarian, so he must be writing this because of that. My dissertation was politically neutral. I mean, it was all about trying to understand the dissents of Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr., Supreme Court Justice, not someone with whom I have a lot of common, not someone that even I particularly admire. But he was the object of study, so I was going to follow questions where they led and try to understand him fully. And it was not helpful to have somebody presuppose my motivations whenever I'm writing about this and that and trying to read into it some sort of libertarian dogma from her perspective that wasn't really there at all. And some of it was so ridiculous. And she wouldn't let me get any of my chapters to my advisors, and they wouldn't, so they didn't get to examine it, and finally had to get the University of Buds involved, and long process, and had to have a new advisor put in. And finally I got through. When I got a new advisor in, I just sort of raced right through it. And it was a very quick process. But that's one sort of example of the way barriers to entry will be placed in the way of people that might, have a different perspective or a different viewpoint. Now, I had the advantages. I was a lawyer when I got into the program, and so I could kind of defend myself, but I can see other people, and I also had a backup plan. If it didn't work out for me in the PhD, I could go out and practice law. Not everyone has that kind of luxury and feels comfortable enough to push back, so.
Wow, that's really amazing. What change, in your opinion, needs to happen to improve academic freedom and intellectual diversity in academia?
Well, in higher ed generally, that is a big topic, and I think there are a lot of organizations out there like the Martin Center and like FIRE who are doing great things as far as academic freedom goes. Obviously, it's one of those things where if you look at the big picture, it's kind of overwhelming. So you sort of just have to go case by case and school by school. So, for example, I'm an administrator in a school, and I can do what's under my control. I would stress if I had to imagine what I would have to do to reform all of higher ed. It's just too, magnificent of a concept for me to comprehend. But I can do things in my school. I can protect intellectual freedom. I can encourage people to express different views. I can bring people to campus to debate and to discuss controversial topics in a civil and constructive way. And so there are lots of little things that can be done that are sort of in the power of one person to do, and that aren't just kind of overwhelming to think about. And so that's how I would sort of approach it. I mean, I also write about these topics, and so I throw my 2 cents in every now and then. But those are sort of small scale ways of gradually pushing academia in the direction of the pursuit of truth and reality and goodness and beauty and these perennial concepts that really the Academy was designed to pursue.
Well, that's great. I'm glad you're taking those steps.
No, thank you.
Now, tell us about the Blackstone and Burke Center for Law and Liberty and your work there as executive director.
Well, thanks. Yeah, the Blackstone and Burke Center for Law and Liberty focuses on the common law tradition and American constitutionalism. So we examine the norms and nurture the institutions of ordered liberty. And we do 3 things, really. We run a Sir Edward Cook Fellowship program for students, and we have 4. So it's been around for 2 years. So 2 students in the first year, 2 students in the second year. Those students come in, work closely with me, and we do reading groups throughout this semester. We just read Patrick Deneen's Why Liberalism Failed, and then Frank Meyer's recently republished book by ISI, What is Conservatism? And we discuss those. We'll be reading Hayek's Law, Legislation, and Liberty next, and we discuss those on a regular basis. We go out to lunch and have sort of an extracurricular education, and then I help them as they look for jobs. They sort of get close mentorship, and I help them try to secure summer positions when they're at that stage. And none of them have gotten to the stage where they're graduating and going out into a career, but presumably when they get to that stage, I'll be able to help them with that process as well. So they get a lot of individualized attention and a lot of just sort of sounding board kind of stuff. I mean, they get to come into my office and say, I'm just struggling with torts, or I don't get this concept in civil procedure. And we can talk through it and help them figure out what it is they don't know so that they can go to their professor, or if I can help them figure out what it is, then I'll help them figure out. So it's a very personalized experience. The other two things we do are a civics education for the general public, and that goes from high school to college level to the law school level. And then we run judicial seminars for state jurists. And our next seminar will be in the spring semester, and Hadley Arcus will be directing it.
Well, that's wonderful. I'm interested in the civic education. Do you go and give talks to local schools? How does that look? All
of that. So I recently gave a talk to students at Auburn High School on the importance of free speech on college campus. We did a Constitution Day event in the rotunda of the Alabama Supreme Court, and we had an Alabama Supreme Court justice, a federal bankruptcy judge, and then a state district court judge. He was a circuit court judge, actually. And we had them talk about their paths to the bench and had them talk about civics education and what they thought ought to be taught in schools and what is or is not taught in schools in the right way. And that was very interesting to get the judge's perspective. And the general public was invited. So it wasn't just lawyers or the bench and bar, but students and undergraduates. And sometimes you get homeschoolers at our events. I mean, we did a Magna Carta traveling reception in the rotunda of the Alabama Supreme Court as well. And Judge Pryor from the 11th Circuit spoke. And we bring in speakers to campus all the time. Most recently, Brad Berzer came down and talked about Russell Kirk and his charity. And I mean, there are just numerous things like that we do. We partnered with FEE, the Foundation for Economic Education, and did a sort of a free market day. And it was law-based, and we talked about law and markets and morality, and that was an exciting event. So just numerous things. I mean, we're doing at least 2 or 3 things a semester right now, and it's really great. It's really active and really exciting.
Well, that's really good to hear. We often hear about the importance of liberty in economic, socio-political, and personal terms, but your center emphasizes the concept of ordered liberty. Tell us, what's ordered liberty?
Well, if you think about it in terms of the social contract theory, when you enter into society, you necessarily agree to play by certain rules. So liberty in civilized society is not the freedom to do anything you want. You have to play by certain rules. And so that's where law comes in. It's liberty under law. And part of that principle is the rule of law. And at the heart of the rule of law is the idea that nobody is above the law. Not the king, not the president, not anyone. The law is sovereign. And that is a notion that keeps government in check. So the whole idea behind social contract theory is that government is by consent, and that government cannot exercise powers beyond which the people have authorized it to exercise. And if it does, then the people are able to rein it back in, because it's ultimately the people who are the source of government's authority. And that's part of ordered liberty. And another part of ordered liberty is just custom and convention and tradition. These are sort of the norms that we live by every day that aren't actually enshrined by law. I mean, just the way we behave politely in society is an example of order. And so we act freely all the time. We are talking right now according to particular conventions, and we're doing it freely. No one's forcing us to do it, but we are doing it in an ordered way. I mean, these are all sort of ideas behind ordered liberty, but in essence, liberty is not just the freedom to do anything you want. You can't just infringe upon the liberty of someone else, for example. But there is a certain order behind it, and part of that's law, and part of that's custom and culture.
Well, that's fascinating. I want to hear about the common law emphasis also. Could you explain the center's emphasis on the common law in the promotion of ordered liberty?
Sure, yeah. Well, one thing that's interesting about the common law is a difficult concept to talk about because a lot of people have many different notions about what the common law is. But the common law is sort of a bottom-up system of order rather than a top-down. So judges in a common law system historically were responsive to culture. There were certain rules and norms that hadn't been codified by statute, for example, but that were known within the community, tacitly known within the community, and according to which judges were able to exercise reason in order to determine the right result in complicated cases. And as these rules and norms gradually became institutionalized through case precedents and case decisions, there was a way to determine what it was that different cultures and communities were thinking, because their values were being gradually embedded into text, judicial opinions, which, by the way, were for many, many centuries given orally and recorded, and you had to hire a reporter to come in and transcribe the opinion if you wanted it written down and included in the yearbooks, is what we called them. There weren't things you signed at the end of the year saying "Have a great summer," but they were actually compilations of cases. So that's what we're referring to with the common law, is more of a bottom-up system of law.
Okay, so final question. Most, if not all, the topics promoted by your center, such as freedom of speech, religious liberty, and economic freedom, are controversial in many academic circles. Have you experienced any on-campus opposition to what you do there from students, faculty, or staff?
No, none at all. I'm very fortunate to be at Faulkner University. It's a very good institution. It's a small Christian liberal arts college with a great books program and a humanities PhD. Our law school has a foundations curriculum. It's a wonderful place to teach. We only have 189 students, so we're very small. We've got a very good student-to-teacher ratio, or teacher-to-student ratio, and it is an excellent place to teach and to learn. And I'm very lucky to be there. And we have had no pushback whatsoever. And part of that's because our job is not really to indoctrinate. We're actually there to get students to think about big questions and to talk about big questions and to read great books and to discuss them. And when you do that, you don't get some sort of stale, simplistic orthodoxy. You get challenged, and you have to think through tough things, and you have to struggle with ideas. And that's part of what we do, is to get students to struggle with ideas and not just come in thinking they know everything or that they've got it all right. They have to be challenged. They have to learn to, Immanuel Kant defined enlightenment as the freedom from your self-incurred tutelage. And that's part of what we're doing, is get them to think outside the box, challenge themselves, because if you are 100% just certain and the way you've arrived at your opinion, that's hubris. That means that maybe you haven't really attained belief the way you think you have. If you haven't struggled to attain your belief, then maybe you haven't actually attained belief. Maybe you're just being kind of lazy and you haven't worked very hard to hold whatever view you hold. And if you haven't, then maybe you ought to start challenging yourselves. And so that's one thing we try to do. And that means that we'll challenge conservative students and we'll challenge liberal students, and we'll bring them together and have them debate and try to see each other's point of view and really examine their assumptions about different topics.
Well, that sounds like wonderful work that you're doing there at your center and at your university in general. Allen, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks very much for having me. Merry Christmas. It's so nice to be in here in a warm building surrounded by good books on a cold day. So I really appreciate it.
Great. Well, we were so happy to have you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.